Hello, school counselors. Welcome to our first webinar of a series for the Region 3 meeting. We were very disappointed to have to cancel the Region 3 meeting because if you can believe it, we had over 300 RSVPs for the meeting. So we wanted to find a way to bring you this wonderful information from our presenters and this professional learning opportunity. So we are recording today all four presentations, and I'm so happy to be here with our first presenter, who is Dr. Melisa Marsh, and she is our Cobb County School Counseling Supervisor, and she is here today to bring us a very important topic, and that is a presentation on suicide prevention. She is a specialist in this area. Dr. Marsh has presented at ASCA, and we are very fortunate to have her as our county supervisor because she developed a safety plan and a reentry plan that we use now here in Cobb County. And she's going to tell us all about that today in her presentation. So thank you and welcome, Dr. Marsh.
Thank you, Barbara. I am so glad to be here with all of you today. And I'm so glad that GSCA was able to find a way that we could still host our region mini conference. It's just wonderful that so many counselors were interested in celebrating together and learning together. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. As you can imagine, we had to modify our presentations a little bit. I really like to be interactive with my presentations. So we're just gonna, be flexible. As counselors,
Yes.
we're always flexible. So that's how this is going to work today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin our presentation this morning. Perfect. Here we go. So as Barbara said, I am Melisa Marsh, and today we're going to talk about responding to suicidal ideation. I know that this can be a really heavy topic. I like to think about it as hopeful, though. If we have a way to respond, then that means that we are stopping students or staff or loved ones from completing suicide. So I know that it can be really heavy, but as I said, I really like to think about it as being hopeful. Just to tell you a little bit about my background and how I got into this, I worked in Fulton County before I came to Cobb. Both have been great experiences, but the high school that I was at was a very high anxiety provoking school, a lot of academic pressures, a lot of social pressures, and in a single year, we ended up having 4 deaths by suicide. 2 of those were current students, 2 of those were former students, and if you know the impact that a single suicide has on your community, you can only imagine what 4 suicides has on a community. And at that time, we did not really have a great program for prevention, intervention, or postvention. And so I worked very closely with my team. I worked very closely with my amazing social worker to really develop and to put some things in place on responding to suicide. So that's where my passion came from. That's where my history has come from, just so you have a little bit of background about me. So at this point, I always like to know who's in the audience. Who do we have? We can't do that today just because of the platform. So I wanted to look at some past data. As Barbara mentioned, I have presented at ASCA. So we're going to look at that past data, and I'm going to share with you some suicide data and trends of what a typical kind of audience looks like and what you guys might look like as a group if we were together. So I always like to find from the audience, does your school district offer a suicide prevention program? We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means, but as you can see, it's usually less than half of the districts or schools that offer a suicide prevention program. Most do not, and a large or a sliver of our counselors don't know. So that's always kind of interesting. Same with our suicide intervention programs. As you'll see, the responses are often similar, with less than half that do have a suicide intervention program, more than half do not, and then there's a part of the pie that don't know if they do. It's always a little bit concerning to me that as counselors, we don't know if our districts or schools have these programs, because we would be the ones who are probably implementing them. So that's more of an indication to me that we probably don't have those programs. The other question that I like to ask is, does your school district offer a post-vention program? And as you can see here, the no's really increase, meaning that, you know, after a suicide or suicide attempt, then there really isn't that care afterwards. So that's always concerning as well. And then of course you can see the yes and the I don't know responses. And again, this data is from when I presented at ASCA. Another question that I like to ask is, has anyone that you know, have you ever known anyone to suicide? As you can see, almost 75% of the responses are yes. And that's never surprising for me, just because of the work that we do, although always concerning and very, very sad. And then what's their relationship to you? So you'll see the red are the students. So of course the work that we do, again, the green are acquaintances, orange friend, the blue is family, and then the purple would be some other kind of relationship in our life. So it's not just in a professional capacity. This also hits us very close to home in our personal relationships. And so responding to suicide is something that we need to know both professionally and personally as well. Have you ever been a helper to somebody with thoughts of suicide? Again, that data is very similar. Almost 75% of us answered yes. And then how well prepared did you feel in order to do so? And this one's always really interesting to me, because that goes back to our training and our comfort levels. And so just a sliver of us feel well prepared. Almost half of us generally feel mostly prepared. About half of us feel partly prepared, and then a sliver feel not prepared. And some of that is just the discomfort with the topic, right? Nobody really enjoys talking about suicide. It is uncomfortable on so many levels. But there's always room to grow. Even those of us who feel well prepared, we can always feel more prepared. So there's always changes and more to learn. So that's kind of the end of me getting to know the audience and what I would have asked you had we been together. Just some statistics to look at. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 34. It was the third leading cause of death, and it had recently changed to the second. And it is only behind all accidents. Accidents altogether is number one, and then suicide is number two. We've seen a 33% increase in suicide rates from 1999 to 2017. That's a huge increase. You know, if you just think about the students in your district or the students in your school, how many students that would actually be. We have a 31.5% of students nationwide felt so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks that they stopped doing some of their usual activities. And as many of you know, that is the definition for depression, for clinical depression. And there's a correlation between clinical depression and suicide ideation and suicide attempts. 17.2% have seriously considered attempting suicide. 13.6% have made a suicide plan. So the difference between attempting suicide and making a plan is actually knowing what that means would be. You know, when we're asking, do you know how you would do it? It's actually having that means. And then 7.4% have actually attempted suicide. So just astronomical numbers when we're looking at the data. I do want to go through some terminology to make sure that we are on the same page as we're having these discussions. When we're talking about prevention for suicide, we're really looking at diminishing the risk of suicide and being proactive, right? And this is what we want to do in all of our practices, is being very proactive. And the same is true with suicide prevention. So an intervention is our direct effort to prevent a person from attempting to take his or her own life. So that's once somebody has already said, I'm thinking about suicide, and then we come in and we're going to intervene with that individual. So there's lots of different ways to do that. That's probably what most of you are the most familiar with. And then a postvention is an organized response in the aftermath of a suicide. And as we saw with the data earlier, this is usually where most schools or most districts are really kind of lacking. It really helps to mitigate other negative effects and prevent contagions of suicides as well by having a postvention, and really helps other individuals who are at risk for suicide. I did also want to talk briefly about using the term either suicided or died by suicide when you're talking about suicide, instead of the term committed suicide. Many of us probably learned that somebody committed suicide, and we've really moved away from that terminology. When somebody has committed something, or when they are committed, it usually has a very negative connotation to it. It usually is associated with a crime. And so we don't want to have that pairing when it comes to suicide. So really trying to change our vernacular and making sure that we are using that they have either suicided or died by suicide. So just something to think about as we're really focusing on terminology. This would be a place where I would ask for questions, but I know that we can't do that. So I'm just going to keep moving along. This is our typical suicidal ideation process. This might be what you see in your schools or in your districts as well. So a student expresses ideation, right? Whether it's to a teacher, whether it's to a counselor or a coach or a band director or whoever it is in the building. So that's reported to the point of contact, and that's usually a school counselor, right? So that's kind of what happens. That point of contact asks the student about their suicidal ideation, hopefully using some kind of school or district protocol if that's available. Usually the questioning involves asking about the ideation, the plans, and the means. So that's usually what we see there. And then the student is monitored until they leave school, right? So making sure, hey, we're going to make sure that you're safe, you're okay, you're going to sit here, we're going to make sure that you're not alone. And then the parent is contacted for pickup. And some serious cases might involve emergency vehicles, right? So this is our typical standard suicidal ideation process. What we're missing in all of this is we have a student who has disclosed suicidal ideation, maybe for the first time in their life, and we're not really asking them, how are you feeling? Why are you feeling this way? Can you tell me about your story? Instead, we're just saying, oh my gosh, you're suicidal. Sit here and we're going to go and call your parents. I can't imagine as a student how terrifying that is, right? We're not really doing any counseling with them. So we're missing some really key pieces with this process. So my question for you, something to think about, this would again be a talking point, but just think about it in your own home right now is, are you comfortable talking about suicide? If you are, like, where did that develop? Where does that come from? If you're not, why not? Where did that develop? How could you become more comfortable talking about suicide? Do you maybe need to go to a training? Do you maybe need to work with somebody in your school, in your district? Could you partner with somebody? Because for these students, you're usually their only lifeline. So it's a question that I'm throwing out to you. I really want you to think about, are you comfortable talking about suicide and helping to remove the stigma of suicide? Most people who are not comfortable talking about suicide have some myths in their mind. So we're just going to go over just a couple myths and facts here that might help you a little bit. One of the first myths is that people who talk about suicide are just trying to get attention. That is definitely not true. Talking about suicide is a warning sign. So we need to take all threats of suicide very seriously. A second myth is that suicide happens without a warning. You know, we all have heard stories about individuals who died by suicide, and it just came out of nowhere, right? And there are cases that feel that way, but when you peel back the layers, almost like an onion, almost, not always, but almost everyone who dies by suicide does display some kind of warning signs. And it's just being more familiar with what those warning signs and what those invitations are. Suicidal students are just overreacting to life's events. We especially hear that with middle school and high school students, or even for our elementary school students, we hear them saying, well, they don't know what that means. They do. They know what dying means, right? And so problems can cause different amounts of stress for different people. So even for an elementary school student, for example, the death of a pet could impact them in a way that they might be thinking that they don't have anything to live for. That might be their only comfort in the world, right? Whereas that might not impact another student the same way. We need to be really mindful that whenever a student says that they're thinking about suicide, it's their reality, and we need to meet them where they are. And the final one that I want to bring up, and this is what we hear a lot with people who are afraid to talk about suicide or concerned about talking about suicide, is that talking about suicide will put the idea in somebody's head. And I hear that all the time, even when I'm doing trainings. And that is definitely a myth. So research shows speaking openly about suicide lets people know that you're comfortable talking about it. If you suggest the word suicide and they're not thinking about it, they'll tell you that they're not thinking about it. But it lets them know that you're a safe person to go to. And then they have somebody that has already named it, that has given them dialogue, and now you're a trusted adult. So just some things to think about as you're considering, are you comfortable talking about suicide? These are some tips that I like to give you for what I call the talk, right? Different stages of life, we have the talk. So this is for having the suicide talk. Remain calm. So our minds are going a million miles a minute. The first thing to think about is just remaining calm. You don't have to say anything. You just have to listen. So let your mind slow down, let your breath slow down, take some deep breaths as you're listening and just stay calm. Ask the person directly if he or she is thinking about suicide. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Stay supportive. You might be the very first person that they have ever talked to about suicide. And these are, again, their feelings, and their feelings are valid, right? So we're not judging their feelings, we're valuing them. Just listen and reassure them that help is available. You don't have to be the person that is going to provide the help. Sometimes we are, and sometimes we're not. But there are resources and there is help that's available for all individuals who are thinking about suicide. And it's just a matter of being able to provide those resources. Again, not judging. You may agree with thinking about suicide. You might disagree with thinking about suicide. You might have religious beliefs that are against suicide. But at this point, we need to set our personal beliefs aside and just be there for the student or staff member or whoever that is thinking about suicide. Provide consistent supervision. Do not leave this person alone. Remove any means for self-harm, and make sure that you follow the suicide protocol and get help for them. So pretty basic. So practicing asking the question. Again, if we were together, we would do this together. So I would encourage you, in the safety of your home, nobody can hear you, to do this, right? So it's hard to ask, are you thinking about suicide, right? Are you thinking about killing yourself? That might be a safer, more comfortable way for you to ask, especially for the littles. You can't ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself, right? Because that means something different. You could be talking about self-harm. You can't ask something like, are you thinking about doing something silly, right? That means all kinds of things. Our middle school boys are doing something silly the minute that they leave your office, right? So that doesn't work. You need to be very direct and clear that we are talking about death, suicide. You have to be able to name it. So here's some suggestions for you about practicing asking the question and maybe framing it in a way that feels softer for you. So the first thing is really kind of framing it in empathy and compassion. So one of the ways that I like to kind of frame it is, sometimes when people are going through what you've been going through, they are thinking about suicide. Have you ever had thoughts like that? Right? It just feels a little softer. Always assume that suicide's on the menu. So you could say something like, sometimes when emotional pain is so intense, people think about suicide. I'm wondering if suicide's ever crossed your mind, right? Again, it's just a little more gentle. But being sure that you're using the direct word. So come up with a way that makes it feel safe for you, but that you're still asking directly. So a couple things about your district and making sure that you're following your district policies, protocols, procedures. You have to make sure that is number one. Something that we've put in place, all of our schools have this, is just a little flow chart. It is a link for you to click on. Hopefully you can see this, but it'll take you, yay, it's working, to a larger version of it so that you can copy it. You're welcome to use it. You're welcome to share it, whatever you need. But this is our just flow chart. So you can really see if a student discloses, if they disclose to another staff member, that staff member reports to our school designee, that school designee assesses the risk, they take them through the safety plan, and then we provide contacting the parent and provide resources. So it's just a pretty easy way of sharing what we do there. So If you have a nice flow chart for teachers, for staff, that's always good to have. If not, something for you to think about. So these are the pieces that we usually find are missing. And Barbara mentioned that we added these just a couple of years ago. The safety plan, the conference summary, the reentry plan, and a checklist. So again, these are all links that you can click on so that you can enlarge, because I know in the PowerPoint you can't really see them. The safety plan, the way that our district has put it in place, we have one for K through 6 and one for 7 through 12. I've included both for you. I know it's a weird breakup, but that was how our legal team wanted us to do it. So when legal says that's how you do it, that's how you do it. And this is whenever somebody expresses suicidal ideation. And so our counselors have now a format that they can sit down and fill out with the student. That's the piece that is most important, is that it is with the student, because we really want them to be a part of the safety plan. It doesn't work if we create it for them. They have to be part of the team. So, and I know some people are afraid of a safety plan, but as we go through this, you'll see they're just developing coping strategies. So that's good for anybody to have, right? Instead of harming myself, I will use these coping strategies. So what would that be? And so then the student talks about coping strategies that work for them, right? Instead of, or if these coping strategies are not working, these are individuals that I'll go get help from at school, outside of school, or if I'm alone. If I'm alone, well, what would I do? Maybe I'd call a crisis line, right? Maybe I would go to a neighbor's house. Maybe I would make sure I can get in touch with my parents, right? So really walking through, what does that look like? We do provide then some of that information for them. We also just have some key notes, dates. What I really love about this is the safety plan follow-up date. My counselors have said that that's really helpful because they'll make a date and an appointment with the counselor and with the student. They put that right on their calendar. So, hey, we're going to meet on Friday, right? And this still works even in a virtual platform because we can fill this out remotely together. If somebody's thinking about self-harm, well, we can still schedule a virtual follow-up in a week, right? To check on our student and see how it's going. These are strategies that still work, and that's really helpful. So the next piece that is included is our conference summary. Again, this is still linked for you. This is really for when our parents are contacted. So our parents are just trying to process the idea that their students have talked about suicide. And I can't imagine how overwhelming that must be for a parent to get a call saying that your student is considering killing themselves. And so this summarizes everything that the parent would need, but it puts it all in a nice, clean format for them. So this is something that you can give to the parent, letting them know when they get home, please provide supervision for them. Here are all the emergency contacts. Please make sure that they don't have any means for self-harm around them. There's a section to be completed by the assessment center and returned to the school. So it also gives some teeth in there so that the school, the parent, and the assessment center are all working together to support the student. And then finally, the last part is our reentry plan, so that way, whether it's a day, 2 days, or 2 weeks, when the student returns from treatment, then we have a meeting. And again, this can be at this point a virtual meeting, or it could be when we're back in the building, a face-to-face meeting. And it takes you through, what do we do during the meeting? What do we do after the meeting? And how do we support the student ongoing? One of the things that I like about this is that we really talk about what kind of makeup work is needed, who needs to be included in that, do we need to have a 504 plan in place, how are we going to support the student with not only academics but with their mental health as they transition back. So making sure that we have a plan in place to support the student coming back so that they are successful and safe in the building. And that's really, really important to me. And just a side note for this, my Cobb counselors have heard me, but this is also a great place to advocate to really reduce the workload for your students, because at this point they need to be focusing on mental health, not focusing on a bunch of small assignments like homework, classwork, quizzes. We really need to reduce the workload to those items that show mastery of the curriculum, so those summative assessments. So if you have more questions about that, you can always let me know, but it's a great opportunity for that as well. So that's the safety plan, the conference summary plan, the reentry plan, and then finally our checklist. And this is just to help the counselors. It's a student safety plan checklist, and it just helps them kind of go through if a student, is suspected of making an attempt on campus, what do you do? If we think that there's suicidal ideation, what do you do? And it literally is a checklist, because when we're in that situation, when counselors are in that situation, it's overwhelming, right? There's a lot to remember. There's a lot to do. And so I just wanted to make it as simple as possible for everybody to make sure that we are on the same page. So really making sure that we have policies and procedures in place so that it is clear and concise for our counselors, our social workers, our school psychologists, and our schools. So those were really the missing pieces that we found. The other thing that I will mention to you is making sure that we, again, have those prevention pieces in place at this point. We now have prevention for suicide at elementary, middle, and high school. At elementary, we're using Julia Cook's book, Flicker of Hope. I will tell you, it's very hard to find prevention for elementary school, so our counselors are doing lessons with Flicker of Hope as a prevention service for suicidal ideation. Our middle school and high schools are using either Sources of Strength or Signs of Suicide. Both are research-based programs, and so they get to choose one or the other as their preventative measure. And then for intervention, we are using ASSIST. We have now 6 trainers in Cobb County schools, and we have over 200 staff members who have been trained in ASSIST, and we're going to continue that moving forward. It's an amazing intervention program. So if you've never checked that out, I would highly recommend, again, research-based suicide intervention program. Because, again, we're doing this virtually, I wanted to just share some counselor reactions to all of this with you. So this was a video from after our first year of implementing these best practices. So you'll hear the counselors say that they've only been using it for 1 year. We've definitely been using it for more now, but this will just give you a sample of how these practices have implemented their work.
I love the new safety plan that Cobb County has given to counselors this year. It's very streamlined and it really just kind of shows step by step what I need to make sure to ask a student if they do come in expressing thoughts of suicide. I think it's very direct, and I like that it's direct because it helps me make sure that I'm not missing any steps. I also like that they give instructions for discussing the situation with the parent, and not only tips for during the meeting, but how to follow up with the parent and the student after the meeting. I also like that during the initial meeting in the safety plan, there's a time to set with the student of when to follow up after their either emergency room evaluation or evaluation with a mental health professional. And I mean, really overall, the safety plan is just really helpful because it takes a little bit of stress from a very complicated situation, and it helps counselors with what is arguably the most difficult situation that they can face.
It's hard being a kid these days, especially being a middle school age kid. So we have a lot of students who are just feeling isolated and hopeless for a whole host of complex reasons. And so a lot of them are thinking about attempting suicide or actually attempting. And fortunately for me, I haven't experienced anyone who has completed. But having a safety arrangement plan has been really helpful for those who thought about it and attempted. So it's really hard on the students, but also the families and community and the staff. And of course, it's hard on us as practitioners. And so having coping skills is really important. What a safety plan did for me is really just kind of freed me up to be present in the moment, because what our people did is they actually incorporated that along with the laws and policy and ethics into the plan, so that I didn't have to worry about whether or not I needed to call DFAS or I needed to reach out to the parents or when I needed to do those things, because I just did a quick run through of the safety plan before I went to actually speak with students. And so a lot of times everyone is looking at you, the principal, the staff, no one else knows what to do. And that crisis can be really, really high risk, but also stressful on us. And so it really freed me up to kind of meet the needs of everyone affected. And on the reentry part, it helps because we get to plan with the students. The students actually get to have some buy-in, have some control over how things go, and we pull from them resources and ideas on how to keep them safe for now, when it's an intervention, and then afterwards, when it's time for them to re-enter into school, it helps us support them more effectively so they, just heal and don't have to experience the same things that led to them needing a safety plan.
So this is the
I'm so sorry. Technology. There we go.
So this is the first year we've used a safety plan, and it has been a real lifesaver when it comes to having students who are saying that they want to hurt themselves. It gives us a script to go by, and it helps us tease out whether or not there's a significant risk. Many students just say these words when they're feeling frustrated, and I think that when we go through some of the questions, it helps them understand that that's a very serious thing to say, and they can understand that we are taking it very seriously, and it helps them know that maybe they either need to change their words if they don't feel that way, or that we're always going to be there to help them through and to help them find coping skills if they really do feel that way. It gives us something to work towards. We list goals, we list coping skills, we list who they can go to for help. So it just keeps us from having to talk off the top of our heads if we are in a crisis situation and are feeling.
And that we never know when it's coming. So
Yeah.
when we have one of these threats, we know we can go straight to our computers or our file folder and pull this, and we can slow down and ask these questions. Additionally, it helps us when we talk to the parents, saying we have a protocol. This is a Cobb County policy that we're going through this with their kid, and that this student either is at high risk or, and they need to come pick the student up, or if they're just saying it out of frustration and we feel like there's low risk, we still send home a list of resources for outside assessment, but we'll send it home to the parent if they simply can't get to the school so that they can sign it. And that way we also have some documentation that this has happened, so that if it happens again, we have something to talk about, that this is the second time or third time, and in a meeting about a safety plan, it gives us some credence and some documentation about the seriousness of the issues.
So we're super glad that we have this, and it's been really helpful. And also the follow-up date on the plan is also helpful for us to remind ourselves to go back and check in with the student. Yeah, it kind of holds the parents accountable to follow up. If this has happened over and over again, a lot of times you wonder what to do next. And so it shows the parents how serious we are, that we really need them to check with an outside professional before we can say that their student is safe to be here with us at school. So I hope you guys enjoy using it as much as we have, and I hope
Thanks to Missy Alex for
thank
supporting
you.
us as counselors, as our supervisors.
So I hope that that was helpful for you guys, just to hear from our Cobb County counselors who have been using it. I do have a list of additional resources here for you that are amazing. There's so many great suicide prevention resources on here. One of the questions that I get a fair amount is also just about funding for some of the prevention and intervention resources. So I do just want to note that there are some fabulous foundations out there. There's also some great grants. So you can always explore those options. If you have questions, you are always welcome to reach out to me, and I can share with you as well how we do some of our funding for our prevention as well as for our intervention, because we try not to ask for our schools to pay for that. We try to pay for that through our central office. So here is my contact information. And again, I just thank you for all of the amazing work that you're doing to keep our students safe. I know that it is a super heavy topic, but if you ever have any questions, I am here for you. And I hope that you guys are safe and healthy and taking care of yourselves and your family as we are home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marsh. This was wonderful presentation and wonderful information on such a sensitive topic. And we just really appreciate you being here with us today and presenting to our Region 3 mini conference virtually. And so thank you so much for this today.
Absolutely. Glad to have done it. So thanks to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Barbara, I just stopped the video. Is that okay?
Okay, perfect. Yes.
Okay, awesome. So then, was that okay, by the way? Did everything go okay?
I mean, you are a master at this. It was flawless. It was truly flawless.
Oh my gosh, you're so funny. I was like, all right, well, I'm just still talking.
No, I'm in awe. It was wonderful. Couldn't have asked for anything better.
Okay, good. So I'm just gonna have to play with how to share that video.
Okay, so I text Jessica, and because she tried to call while we were recording, and I told her what the issue was. So yeah, I told her to hang tight. We'll have to figure out how to get it to her.
Okay, perfect. That's not a problem. So yeah, I did the stop recording. So
Okay.
We'll just need to figure out now. And I asked for it to be saved to my desktop. So yeah, I'll just have to like play and see.
Okay. Do you have her email address?
I do.
Okay.
Yes.